Welcome to the February 11 work session of the Ann Arbor City Council. We have before us today a work session related to the fiscal year 20 and 21 budget, overview, and general fund, led by the indomitable Howard Lazarus. Mr. Lazarus, you have the con.
Good evening. And thank you very much for the time this evening to mark the beginning of our formal budget process. We have many members of our distinguished staff here to support discussion and question. And I'd like to thank all of them for their participation, because through their efforts, we're able to provide an exciting program of service delivery for the fiscal year 20 and 21 financial plan that optimizes the value to our community. Please note this is not the administrator's final budget submittal, but a program offered to you that will provide the basis for our discussions over the coming weeks. We do have a lot of information to go through this evening, and I request that you hold your questions until the end so we can get through all of it, reminding you that we do stop at 8:45 for public comment, and then you'll have the opportunity over the coming weeks to send your questions in as part of the budget Q&A process. So tonight we'll review the general fund activities along with a few non-general fund programs that will be specifically called out at the time, since we have the appropriate staff present here this evening. Our next session will be held on Monday, February 25th, followed by March 11th. Please notice that there is no work session scheduled on March 25th due to conflicts with the public schools spring break. I will present the city administrator's recommended budget on April 15th, and per the city charter, adoption is required at the second meeting in May. Are we okay? Okay. So this evening's presentation is consistent with the strategic direction Council provided at the December and January work sessions. Our discussion tonight focuses on changes from the current year and the anticipated impacts. Impact sheets have been provided as an attachment to the agenda. A new feature that we are going to preview this evening are a couple of templates for finance and fire that show the externally facing metrics that we hope to add to the city's website as part of this budget process. Those templates provide the measures by which our community can determine whether we are achieving the excellence that they ask of us. Again, our goal is to have each one of these completed and posted as part of the final budget and financial plan for 20 and 21. Equity and inclusion, as we look at the service enhancements with an eye on budgeting consistent with strategic direction, we started reporting on equity and inclusion measures last year per council resolution, and we have been providing quarterly updates. So there is funding of an equity and inclusion program development in the budget. We have initiated police and fire cadet programs, both to increase the opportunity to diversify our workforces, but also as the best value to put more officers and firefighters on active response and patrol. The Independent Community Police Oversight Commission is funded at the $150,000 level, with the acknowledgement that that number may need adjustment later in the year once the commission is up and running. We also have funded some accessibility improvements throughout the City Hall and through other city buildings, and we've added additional funding for street light and active transportation improvements, most notably crosswalk improvements. Under the heading of ensuring a financially stable and active city government, we've added a contract administrator to support work and mitigate risk, and to help better provide support to our project managers and ensure compliance with the many procurement-related initiatives Council has approved. Among them are green fleets, our environmentally preferred purchasing, and enforcing prevailing wages. Our pension and post-employment benefits programs are appropriately funded, and Mr. Crawford will lead you through that in a little bit. Under promoting responsible economic development, We have added additional resources in planning and construction to be more responsive and to improve the city's image as a place to do business. And as far as protecting the environment as responsible stewards of natural resources, we have allocated the county millage to climate action programs, as is the current guidance from council. We are funding the Clean and Renewable Energy and Clean Fleets Initiative, and we are continuing the Sustaining Ann Arbor Together management program, microgrant program. There's a lot of attention been paid to building and maintaining sustainable infrastructure systems. So we have added a capital sinking fund to serve for the accumulation of funds for those needs that keep our facilities functional and fully compliant, and to provide for expenditures in future years so that we don't skew the budget when an unforeseen requirement comes up. Streetlight replacement continues to be a priority. And then finally, we will enhance our community collaboration through the funding of the Priority-Based Budgeting Initiative and inserting continuing funding for the Boards and Commissions recognition event, which we held for the first time this year, and for continuing the Citizens Academy, which has been extremely successful as well. Internally, there are some other service enhancements as well that I'd like to address. One of them is conversion of a temporary position in human resources in the benefits area. That's reimbursed by the risk fund. Our HR staff oversees over 80 different medical programs for both active and retired workforce. We can't afford to lose the expertise due to that being funded in a temporary position. We've also added $100,000 for succession planning in the overhire program, which is one of the most innovative and effective programs to ensure continuity as we look at personnel retirements. Within the city attorney's office, a quarter of the FTE for the contract administrator I mentioned before is there to provide support to our project managers and to relieve some of the administrative burden from one of our attorneys. We've also added $100,000 for unseen outside legal requirements. The reason for doing that is when a requirement comes up, very often we have to scramble around to find funding to defend the city against a liability that may have already been incurred. This allows for us to be timely in helping the city attorney provide for the city's response. Under mayor and council, we're proposing to increase the 0.75 FTE management assistant to a full FTE, and there is additional funding of $24,000 for recurring and non-recurring expenses that I'll address in a little bit. The county millage, I'm sure, will continue to be a topic of discussion. The FY 2021 budget plan includes a separate fund for those proceeds so that it can, we can provide transparency on the use. The current city policy provides 40% for affordable housing. 25% of that amount will support the Housing Commission for operation support and tenant support services. 75% goes into the Affordable Housing Fund. 40% is for climate change, renewable energy, and our resiliency programs, and then 20% goes towards pedestrian safety, including $115,000 for new streetlights, $105,000 to repair existing streetlights, and $220,000 for pedestrian crossings. And that is in addition to the $1.5 million I previously identified. Some non-departmental impacts. There's a $416,000 net savings. And the math behind that is that there was a non-recurring rebate of the excess fund balance from the risk fund, half of which goes into the general fund, which is $2.1 million, and that was due to accumulations of benefit savings. That's where the $1.5 million for the active transportation comes from. It's where the funding for the inclusion contract was identified. There's some additional funding for staff training to support growth and development, and then as I mentioned before, we've added $100,000 for succession planning. So at this time, I'm going to turn the mic over to our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Tom Crawford.
Good evening. So on this slide, slide 10, one of the takeaways that I wanted you to be sure to get is You've heard me talk before about our structural deficit, and that's that our recurring revenues go up 2 to 3% per year, and our recurring expenditures go up 2.5 to 3.5%. This is a little bit of a deviation this year. We haven't seen that before, but what we see as we look forward is that our recurring revenues can go up 4%, which is really the highest we've seen, and with 2.2 in the second year, and then the recurring expenditures up 4.1 at 3.1. And so if you compare recurring revenues with the recurring expenditures, you'll see we're largely balanced in this year. So when I've talked about our structural deficit, it's not that we're in a deficit today, it's that as time goes by, our rate of revenue tends to not keep up with our rate of expenditures. So 2020 looks to be a year that has worked to our favor. In 2021, you see that dynamic coming back in the way that we're forecasting, and what we expect to occur is the more traditional kind of deficit generation, although it's somewhat mild. The key drivers of this on the revenue side are property taxes, which are projected to go up 3.5% and 3%. Those are very robust for us. Reflects a significant amount of construction. It's coming down a little bit as some of these projects get built, and we're watching the pipeline to see if new stuff comes in. State shared revenues is something I do want to point out to you, because state shared revenues, if you remember, has two components. One is the constitutional portion, which is a portion of sales taxes that are remitted back to the city, and the other is a statutory portion, which the legislature takes from the sales taxes and decides how much they want to give us. And what we've done is we're increasing the constitutional portion as they have forecasted it. On the statutory portion, we're not recommending that you take an increase on that as they provide it this year. And you may recall that we've talked about that before. The idea is that as we get farther along, a few years down the road, we're building up the capacity that you'll have funding for your non-recurring requests. We don't really have a lot of confidence that they're going to give us all of these statutory state shared revenues. And so what this does is not make that item be a problem for you in future years. If it doesn't get appropriated in a future year, you just have less one-time monies. So that's the strategy behind that. It's about $150,000 in 2020, and then an additional $150,000 in 2021. On the recurring expenditure side, our major expenditures are people. We deliver services, so it is largely wage adjustments, which reflects the contracts for the labor unions, and a 3% assumption for non-union employees. And then the related benefits, pension, VEBA, healthcare. Those are the primary factors. In the impact sheets you'll see this year, I've mentioned to council a couple of times that in order to really attack this, the pension volatility you have, we should reset the base on that. And so one of the impacts we've included here is an additional $500,000 contribution from the general fund, and I'll touch on that in another minute here. So the projections for the general fund, I want to walk you through this chart just briefly because it may be a little confusing on the math. The first section, which says existing operations, is revenue minus expenditures. This is the recurring portion. It does not include the non-recurring. So we've got a small surplus in 20 and a $580,000 deficit in 21. And then below that, you've got two sections. Staff requests. You've got we have staff is requesting recurring revenues and recurring expenditures. And then that line that says, that's bolded, adjusted recurring surplus, that is from the top section. I'm going to take the 150,000, and you add the 274 and the 68, you get the 493. So it is the adjusted recurring operations. And then that last section are your non-recurring items, and that's just straight up math. It's the 2.3 million minus the 2.8 is a $500,000 use of fund balance. The bottom line of all this, from walking from our projection, including all the recurring staff requests and all the non-recurring staff requests, is basically a break-even operation almost in 20, and a use of fund balance of $277,000. That is if you approved all the requests that we're going to be reviewing. When we talk about general fund, we also want to know what our reserves are in case you have problems and for all the other reasons that we have reserves. We included this graph and a little bit of data to explain a few things. One is you'll see the dip in 2018 That's the acquisition of the Y lot that was occurred right at the end of our fiscal year. You'll see in our projection in 2019 that that has recovered as we issued the debt for that and restored the balance of that fund. On the right-hand side, you'll see a couple of columns. When we talk about unassigned fund balance, we usually calculate it in two ways. One is, what is the fund balance, unassigned fund balance as a percent of expenditures? And the other is backing out pass-through items that come through. So for example, the AETA millage comes into the general fund and we send it right back out to the AETA. So if we back that income and expenditure out, you get this, these adjusted numbers. On an adjusted basis, we're in the 17 to 18%. We've been shooting for 18, and for all intents and purposes, you're right there. So moving to the long-term obligations. On the pension system, the first line shows what our unfunded liability is. We're presently projecting $79 million for 2020 and $82 million for 2021. But this is a very large plan, and it's a very mature plan. So that is actually 87% funded, which is considered fairly strong, even though the goal is still 100%. The contributions that the city needs to make are around $14 million, and the general fund portion of that is around $11 million. We have a lot of employees in the general fund. One thing I want you to take away is we look at this every year, and there are a lot of assumptions when you do these actuarial analysis, and we have independent actuaries who help us through that. And last year when we did this analysis, we determined that it would take 16 years for us to get fully funded. We went backwards this past year by 4 years, so we're now projecting 20 years. The conclusion that you can take from that is we're relatively simple to assumptions. We're pretty sensitive to assumption changes. So what happened was we did every 5 years, we take our assumptions that the actuary uses in the report and we move them forward for all the actuals excuse me, that we know. And what occurred this year when we did our 5-year assessment was that the police and fire liability was higher than we had previously projected. And so that's the main item that's contributing to that 4-year change. The recommendations, when you look at a very mature plan like this, and I know we could talk about legacy costs for quite some time, is I continue to suggest that you reset this policy that we have at 2% increases that needs to start when we're at a higher level. So included in this, what I mentioned earlier, is a $500,000 adjustment to help move us in that direction. That is a staff request. And then the second item is continue to look at alternative ways to minimize the volatility that the city has in its contributions. On retiree health care, this system is very different kind of from an economic perspective. While the liability is higher, $105 million in 2020, we are already 64% funded, which is really favorable compared to others. And the system is largely closed, so our funding progress moves pretty closely with our plan. If you look at the change in the assessment the actuary had from year to year, you'll see we went from 12 years to 11 years, reflecting that. In this plan, we're not very sensitive to assumption changes. Our assumptions have been strong enough that I really haven't seen any material changes from if we miss them. The thing I would say on this is, for recommendations, is if we underrun, this is an insurance plan, so if we underrun on our health care, you've got a couple of alternatives. One is rebate that savings back, which is what you, Mr. Lazarus, referred to a few moments ago, and let the organization use those resources, or put it in, transfer that savings over to the VBA to try to knock down that liability faster. There are advantages to both as you consider the city being in a service deficit versus the city being able to accelerate forward this pay down of liability, which is when it's accomplished, it will allow you to have more resources on a recurring basis. So moving into the impacts for the financial services area, the one-time impacts, I just have a few here. One of them is a request for $8,000 in the city assessor's office, we have papers that we're trying to digitize to move stuff online. We've decided to leave a lot of stuff offline because it's not accessed much. This is the portion that would really complete that office in getting online as much as we would desire. And then we've previously talked about priority-based budgeting here, and in checking with the consultant, we started that survey that we did last year. If we were to move forward with priority-based budgeting, there would be a $40,000 one-time expenditure for the consulting services to walk us through the process and train staff. And then there would be a recurring, and that's the $40,000. And on the recurring impacts, there would be a $20,000 annual charge for their software and their support. Separate from that, there's a savings of $61,000 that we're recommending we give back, basically. We're using fewer appraisal services for tax appeals than we had planned, and we feel comfortable with this reduction. And then there's the contract administrator position that was referenced earlier by Mr. Lazarus. As far as performance measures, when we look at the health of the city's financials, you've seen some of these measures before. This is a graphical or pictorial description of those measures. I won't go through all of them, but you'll see that there's 6 or 7 measures that we've discussed before are all here, and they should be with the same data that you've seen. It's a nice way to, we thought it was a nice way to describe, put a little text there. It's obviously easier to read when it's on the full website, but a little text to describe what the measure is, and then a nice little graphic to put it in some context. So priority-based budgeting. Every organization, every city has priorities in one form or another. So the process we're going through now is a prioritization that you ultimately will decide when you adopt the budget in May. However, the priority-based budgeting firm, or the organization that I refer to as PBB, they have a model that we can go through. And this model, describe the process here just briefly, is you survey the residents to understand their priorities. And the survey we did recently can really capture most of that. I don't know that we'd have to do much more to round that out. But the important thing is you ask them what's important and what do those what results do you need for that to be successful? And when you know that information, you can kind of figure out where your goalposts are, where you're going to go to. Then the organization needs to go back and do a program inventory. A program is all the services we provide. That's extensive. We'd go through all of our programs, and then we'd go through and we'd cost them. We would allocate our costs for all of them and our revenues to understand what the financial impact is for the organization to deliver each of those programs to the residents. Then phase 2 is where you actually do the prioritization. The program managers who deliver those programs have to compare what the residents said they want with what they believe that how much that program contributes to achieving that directive. The program manager does it, and then it's peer reviewed by the other program managers, so you don't have someone just self-selecting their program to be successful. And then lastly, the prioritization is done. You look at all those prioritization and decide which ones you want to do and which ones you don't, with the knowledge of the best we can on which ones contribute the most to your desired results. So within the model they have, there's kind of these 4 levels. The bottom level 1 is a rational tool for stabilizing the budget. We have, I would consider, a relatively stable budget this year, so that's not, you always get that, but that's good. Reallocating resources, we do that as well, and this model will help do that with a lens that you don't presently have. 3 and 4 is where I think you'd probably see more of the work and maybe something different than what we've been doing. And so as you think about priority-based budgeting, I'm happy to share more information with you, but I wanted to give you just a soundbite of it as a reminder here today. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Chief Faunus.
Good evening. If you look at, if I can get to it. If you look at the police impacts, you'll notice that most of our impacts are related to equipment replacement or purchases. We have items like bulletproof vests, tasers. They have a 5-year expiration date, and we're required to replace them. as a best practice. We're going to a new radio system, so we have to replace some of the radios that are actually in the motorcycle helmets. The exciting thing is the addition of 2 civilian FTEs in the police cadet program, which is a big step in the right direction with all the difficulties we have in just maintaining our staffing at our allocated levels. Right now we're 7 below where we should be due to retirements, with a bunch more retirements coming up over the next few years. This will, if approved, free up 2 officers to be out on the street at a substantially reduced cost to what an officer is. This is fully loaded, $64,349 for the 2 employees. Officers, approximately $100,000 each when it's loaded. So it also will greatly increase our diversity efforts. If anybody's economically challenged or unsure if they want to go into the police business, it gives us a chance to sort of try them out and for them to try out the profession. So it's a win-win. They would come in with the expectation that if they did not end up being sent to the police academy by us, that they'd be done after a year. So that would allow us to bring in somebody else. And that's really it, other than if you have any questions in the future about some of the equipment. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chief Kennedy.
All right, good evening, Mayor and Council. Okay, fire impacts, one of the big ones we have, emergency management is under the fire department. We have 22 tornado sites, 7 of which need to be replaced. A lot of this technology goes back to the early 90s and just sits outside 24/7. So it's just simply a matter of maintenance. We're not adding additional sites. We have excellent city coverage with that. In terms of reductions, we had a opening through attrition with our Fire Prevention Bureau. So the thought is that's a relatively easy way for us to achieve some savings by just not filling a already vacant position, and we achieve the IT and vehicle savings on top of that. One, to not let a good idea go to waste, and a lot of credit to Chief Honest and his crew. We want to kind of hook on to their idea with the Fire Cadet program for the exact same reasons that Chief Honest mentioned. We think it's a great idea. Right now, for the better part of a decade, all firefighters we've hired with qualifications, and that's drastically reduced our applicant pool. So the thought is we would bring in people without qualifications at a lower rate, put them through the schooling, and try to increase our diversity through that effort as well. So again, a lot of credit to Chief Honest and police for that. So I don't normally give police a lot of credit, so that's a unique one. Little friendly rivalry there. All right. For the dashboard, huge amount of credit needs to go to Tom Shuchuk and Josh Barone from IT. The idea with this is that some of this data will eventually be live feed. The numbers you're seeing there are from calendar year 2018. Some of the things to kind of point out, we went on just over 7,500 calls in 2018. Of those, 5,100 were emergencies. That's where it's a lights and sirens call, and with that, we were on scene within 6 minutes, 89% of the time. So as we have better data now, we're working on dial in what is our metrics and what's our service delivery. But this is a great tool for us to be able to give to you as our elected officials and the public what it is we have going on in the fire department. So pretty straightforward in terms of most of our requests. And up next will be Cheryl Sanborn with courts.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. My name's Cheryl Sanborn. I'm here on behalf of the court. I just have this one slide for your review. Please keep in mind that the court budget is largely personnel expenses and contracted services. But when you're looking at this, we are proposing $32,000 in recurring net savings. What you're seeing below that is just sort of the higher level adjustments that were made within the budget. It doesn't show all the background lower amounts. So don't expect those ones below to add up to the 32. One of the things that we've changed recently that you'll see listed up there is the recurring software application costs. We are partnering with a company called Court Innovations. They offer Matterhorn software, and that is specific for courts to use. So we're going to be offering citizens the ability to enter pleas online to misdemeanor cases, ability to request reviews of their financial amounts owing to the court if they're having trouble paying, and then also online warrant reviews. So if someone's failed to appear or failed to pay and they have a warrant, they can contact us without coming into the court, and if they're eligible, we can work with them electronically. That's all I have tonight, unless you have questions. All right, thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm glad to be here tonight and appreciate the questions at the end part.
Can I just call point of order?
Sure, because I can't make this remote work, which is
Good,
kind of
good. I've got 30 seconds. As a council member, I'm wondering if we ever voted on or it went through council rules that we have to be quiet until the end when we've forgotten most of our questions?
It's not a rule.
Oh, okay. It's just somewhat frustrating, but I will be a good council member.
Well, I love questions, so if you want to ask questions, I don't mind a bit. Derek Delacourt, good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm here on behalf of Community Services, obviously. For the most part, in our service area, everything is well and good, I hope. The first slide here is dealing with the Building and Rental Services General Fund. This is the portion of our building operations that does not come out of the construction fund. We're proposing a $44,000 net savings over the next 2 fiscal years. I'm not going to read every bullet point. I'm sure you're capable, but some of the highlights are, as you've heard discussed earlier, we're discussing housing a quarter of an FTE for a contract administrator in this service area or in this unit. There are slight reductions to the DEER program and county contract over the next few years, and those will mostly be dependent on what council wants to do with both of those programs going forward. But as of now, on paper, those cuts are being shown. So those are the major impacts other than normal adjustments that go on a yearly basis. Let me get this to work this time. What am I not getting? Yeah, it does. Okay. This is probably where you're going to see our most changes. This is the ongoing reorganization and continued utilization of the building department. In the construction fund, we are doing well in the construction fund. One of the things we're doing in an attempt to keep into compliance with Council's Green Fleets policy is we are proposing the conversion of 13 inspector vehicles to electric vehicles over the next fiscal year, probably 2, but we're showing the complete cost in this fiscal year's budget. We are proposing 3 new additional FTEs. This is in combination with our conversations with BRAG, which is the Builders and Remodelers Association of Ann Arbor. We've gone to them and talked to them about whether they would rather see a reduction in permit fees or an increase in service. To date, universally and unanimously, they've said, yeah, we would rather see an increase in service and more FTEs and more additions to staff and other things to increase the time it takes to get the process completed in the city. So that's what we're proposing. We can certainly go into detail about what those 3 FTEs would be, but we think they're reasonable and justified and well vetted through the BRAG program. So the thing that's not shown here in addition is we will be back to discuss the Track-It replacement software. That's probably going to be a contract and a budget adjustment request prior to this year's budget because we've selected a vendor and are moving forward with that contract. But that's the other component of the building department or the construction fund adjustment that we've worked through over the last couple of years, and we think that's going to kind of revolutionize what we do as a building department and help us provide better service to the community and internally and externally as well. So those are the 2 biggest changes to the construction fund at this point. Parks continues to run very, very well. We are proposing a net savings of $125,000 over the next 2 years. That's due to the litany of small adjustments you see in front of you, including some adjustments to fleet and IT. We have, as usual, reevaluated fees, and we'll be recommending some minor fee increases based on utilization, but all of which we feel still keeps us well in line with competing communities and costs well below the service provided. So we'll be able to provide details of those going forward. We are proposing an additional FTE as a park planner. The city historically has had more than one park planner. Several years ago, the park's capital fund and the reserves were reduced to about $750,000 a year. One park planner was able to handle that capital fund and manage those projects reasonably. We're now up to about $1.5 million per year in capital. We believe one park planner is not able to deliver the projects that the community is demanding out of that capital fund and in a timely manner. So we think the adjustment and the ability to bring in an additional park planner will allow us to better expend those capital funds and do the litany of projects that we're proposing over the next couple of years. So that would be the major change to parks at this point. And then the last one for us is planning. Not a lot of changes to our day-to-day operations. We are proposing a $34,000 savings over the next 2 years, mostly through better allocation of staff time where the fees are charged. Some changes to the fee structure. It's been since 2008 or 2013 since most of the planning fees have been adjusted, so it's long past due. So we will have the details for those if requested and when needed. And then the biggest one is the placeholder. We've been talking about a master plan since I've been here for the last 3 years. The RFP is out, and by the time you guys are asked to adopt a budget, we should have an actual cost for that. We've stuck in $500,000 as a placeholder just based on similar communities and what they've spent on master plans over the last decade or so. But we anticipate there's going to be a significant amount more conversation about how and how much we should spend on that plan going forward. But the RFP is out, and by the time the actual budget is presented, we should have an actual cost based on those responses. So those would be the highlights from us at this time, and obviously I'm here to answer any questions when it's opportune.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Brian Steglitz, and I am with Public Services, and here to give you, share the impacts for public services for the coming fiscal years. One-time impacts, the first item that is bulleted is to reallocate some existing systems planning staff to address some planning for the tree line. But the majority of the costs associated with the one-time impacts for public services general fund are associated with the dams, which is probably why I was asked to be here tonight. We are just on the heels of completing a 5-year safety inspection that we're obligated to do associated with our 2 dams that generate hydropower, Barton and Superior Dam. And it's a fairly robust effort, and associated with that, there are some follow-up items that we've been asked to do, and that's what is reflected in some of the costs that are before you for one-time impacts. So that's the majority of the $256,000. And really, these costs are on the heels of a lot of dam failures that have happened around the country, and FERC is, who is the federal agency that regulates us, has become quite conservative in their approach to dealing with dam issues. And every time there's a dam failure, there's a relook at what the regulatory requirements are and a lot more significant compliance things that we need to do. So a fair bit of that is addressing some of these administrative and regulatory needs, but some of it is also to do some repairs. And remember that we are dealing with 2 dams that are in the neighborhood of 100 years old, so there's a fair bit of infrastructure needs we have associated with keeping them safe and functional. So in the short term, we have some of the planning work we need to do, but as you see in the note, there's $800,000, and there's actually some additional projects coming up in the next 2-year budget cycle in FY22 and 23 to do some more significant repairs at these facilities that will probably be in the couple $1 million range. In terms of recurring impacts, the net of the recurring impacts is a total of $10,000 net savings, and three highlights that are shared with you on this slide. One is an asset management software license that we are planning on procuring. The engineering reduction in professional services associated with some street lighting asset management work that is complete, so we no longer need those professional services. And some of the training and compliance funding needs are some of the items that I just mentioned associated with the dams. On the positive side, some additional compliance work that we think is going to continue to be a need in the future. And then the training is reducing some of the training asks that we have in order to do a better job of achieving what our budget targets were. That's all I have on dams. I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. Mr. Postma?
Folks, we have two, good evening, we have two one-time impacts. There's a planned leave of absence for one person in my office this summer for approximately 3.5 months. So we will likely need to get some temp help in on that. We have our city law data conversion program. We're moving to another system, and we're moving all of the data from that system to the new system, and this should take us into the decades into the future. So this has been in the works for some time, and we're looking forward to it. The city administrator talked about both of the others, the contract administrator and unanticipated legal costs to the extent that they arise. So that's it.
So again, I'd like to thank staff who's presented and who will be here to respond to questions. A couple items as we head towards the end of the formal briefing. There are some impacts from discussions with various council members and mayor and council. There are some one-time impacts for a copier and badge reader for a council workspace, as several of you have asked for. There's some other miscellaneous items that are detailed on the impact sheets. On a recurring basis, this past year, we funded the boards and commission recognition event really out of the city administrator's contingency. We've added in a small allowance for each council member of $500. We haven't been able to do that in the past, but it will really fund your requirements for travel, training, and any other miscellaneous costs that may pop up through the year. And then we have increased the executive assistant to full-time. So that's from a quarter of an FTE that's been added as well. And that's really to also support mayor and council. City administrator has one-time impacts. We're looking to put some money aside to establish an intern and sort of a jobs corps program to provide some opportunities to work with community-based organizations and use the city's employment to opportunities to give some youth, particularly at-risk youth, a chance to get a better start. The city clerk has a $90,000 revenue for the presidential primary election, which is kind of scary to consider that'll be next spring. But that's also a reimbursed cost, so there's no net to the general fund. On the fleet and facility side, there are some ADA accessibility improvements throughout City Hall and the Justice Center, and those are listed on the impact sheets as well. That's an ongoing requirement that you'll see into the future years. And then from the risk fund, there's some one-time costs in the safety area to generate the professional drawings needed for fall protection due to an audit we did this past year. On the recurring side, there's 79,000 net savings. There was some temp pay in the administrator's budget that we no longer need. We are going to fund the 8 sessions of the Ann Arbor Citizens Academy. There's a little bit of an increase in conference and training, which previously had been in the city administrator's contingency. So hopefully by lining everything out, there'll be better visibility into that line item, which has been maybe a source of head scratching for council in the past. And then on the city clerk side, that's where the medical marijuana fees reside right now. And we've estimated 80,000. It's a fairly conservative mid-range estimate as that is an evolving and continuing field. Oops. The Office of Sustainability and Innovation has some recurring impacts of a net $53,000 in cost. And you can see there are some dues that were scattered around different city agencies. Some were funded, some weren't. And Ms. Stoltz is here. She can answer questions as to what each of those are, should you have them this evening. And then there's some other miscellaneous costs that were previously not budgeted. On the human resources side, there's a $16,000 net cost. The conversion of the full-time to temp to an FTE, as I mentioned before, is offset by revenue from the risk fund. But again, there are some miscellaneous costs involved as well. And then on the fleet and facilities side, we have a recurring impact of a $10,000 net positive. We've eliminated one vehicle from the fleet as we've looked at usage, and we've reduced city staff time with one building that we had transitioned to the university's dental school for the community dental clinic that we're no longer responsible for the maintenance of. On the safety side, this all comes out of the risk fund. It's not a general fund impact. There is a temporary hire that's in there to help us continue to make our facilities safer. We have consolidated some things that were scattered throughout other parts of the budget in one place to provide better visibility, and those are crane inspections and some prescription safety glasses. And then Doug Forsyth is continuing to develop and implement an incident management system so we can learn from incidents and continue to improve our safety record. If you remember, this past year we celebrated a rather significant reduction over the last several years of accidents in public services, which ultimately leads to lower cost and a healthier workforce. So as we start the process of going through the budget, I ask you send your questions to Ms. Higgins, and then copy me, Mr. Crawford, and Ms. Lancaster. Sarah asked that I remind you not to send your questions through the RFI system, that she will handle budget questions and post them with responses on a weekly basis to the budget webpage. And with that, since we got through this a little faster than I perhaps anticipated, we have plenty of time to respond to any questions that you may have.
Councilmember Griswold.
Given that the budget is one of the most important functions of City Council, if not the most important, I'd like to suggest that in the future we be able to ask questions after each speaker. These are critical issues that we need to address, and to wait until the end is extremely frustrating. And I'll just point out one issue that really got me upset, and that is regarding the fire department. We sort of breezed over the fact that 89% of the time, our response time is 6 minutes or less. We had a fire fatality where the response time was 8 minutes. So I really would have liked to have the opportunity to understand what the other 11% of the time look like in terms of response time, and if there's anything that we can do to what does staff need to improve that? Because we just had a fatality, and that's extremely upsetting.
Chief Kennedy is here.
Would you
if
care
you'd
to
like
answer
him
that?
respond to that question.
Please feel free to have that question posed now.
Okay, I'm asking that question right now. Is there anything that council can do to help you to reduce the risk of a loss of life?
So certainly our fire fatality 2 weeks ago was very tragic. It was on January 31st, which was the second day of that polar vortex. So one of the issues with the response time there is crews were in quarters. So they were responding. That fire happened on the north side of the city, so they were responding out of the station off of Plymouth Road, the university-owned station. That is one of the further kind of edges of their district. So I would say, given the weather conditions and what was evolving that night, that we were just under 8 minutes to get there. The response times are broken down into two components. There's a turnout time, which is when the alarm goes off in the station for firefighters to get in the truck and go, and then there's a travel time. Travel time is 100% driven by station distribution. And that was one of the things that we attempted to start that conversation with the fire station master plan that was sent out, I believe, a couple weeks ago. And that's simply the distribution of fire stations throughout the city. The only way to really drive down that travel time is increase number of fire stations. It's not feasible for us to say drive faster, and certainly travel time at 3 a.m. is going to be different than travel time at 3 p.m. On a weekday. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. Regarding those other 11% of the incidents, a lot of our calls, where we run into some extended times are on the freeways, where it's an eastbound call and we have to loop westbound to get back to it. So that will count against us. We are working to scrub data from mutual aid responses because those are kind of outliers, and I'm quite sure the time reflected does scrub out those mutual aid responses. We've really made huge progress with help from IT over the last year to really have more reliable data with the fire department. And so I'm hoping I know as we go forward, we're going to have better data, and we are focusing on both that turnout time, so the time that we can get crews out of the stations as fast as possible. Again, that ties very directly in with that fire station master plan for newer facilities, different station alerting methods. There's not a single magic bullet for any of that.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything that we could do to assist you. So it seems like you have a good handle on the process and you're doing everything possible to keep the time down.
The real answer would be we would need more stations and that significant capital expenses, which is dwarfed by long-term personnel expenses. So.
Oh, okay, one last question. So it was 8 minutes until the first truck arrived. Did you have 4 firefighters when that first truck arrived, or did you have to wait for a second vehicle before you had the 4 firefighters so that 2 could go in?
So all of our staffing is 3 pieces, or excuse me, 3 personnel on our equipment. By the time that the first truck arrived, our battalion chief, I believe, was pretty much immediately on scene right after. So as that first crew was stretching the hose line, being prepared to make entry, the battalion chief was on the scene. So there was, in talking with the initial responders on the scene, I don't feel that there was a delay of them having to wait. The other part, too, is MIOSHA allows that if we have a suspected rescue, we do not have to wait for that 2 in and 2 out, which is, I believe, what you might be referring to.
Yes.
So if it's a known rescue scenario, that 2 in and 2 out is, MIOSHA does not require that. So, but we did have 4 people on when they made entry into that residence.
Thank you very much.
Councilmember Hayner.
Thank you, Chief Kennedy. So if I read this correctly, we've been going along without a fire inspector, and it's been working out for you? That's what I'm seeing here?
He retired in December.
Okay.
Yes.
And you've been able to, it appears that you guys have been able to do the work necessary without replacing him at this point, and that you're anticipating that moving forward?
We're working through that.
Okay.
He was doing a lot of special assignments, and so we've tried to reassign some of that load. A lot of that load was related to community engagement, and so that's something that both myself and the assistant chiefs have taken on, a more active role. So a lot of that is kind of through redistribution of his tasks, but we believe that minus that 1 inspector is something that we're willing to give a shot with.
And the fire inspectors that currently are actively working now, that's a mix of the new construction plus the recurring fire inspections that we have on, that's the, like, housing inspection, that type of thing?
Correct. So our fire marshal is charged with doing the plan review of new site proposals and new construction. The remaining inspectors are mainly focused on the inspections of existing occupancies.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Lum.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, long through there, Chief Kennedy. Bear with me. First, just thank you, Mr. Lazarus, Mr. Crawford, and all the staff who are here tonight for providing this helpful, informative overview, and also for the budget impact sheets, which are always very helpful. To the I have a couple public safety questions, and I'll send in more specific questions later on. So these are just some general questions to follow on to Councilmember Griswold's question. And perhaps I missed it, but on slide 21, and the fire department budget impact sheet, I didn't see any reference to either the fire station master plan or to any actions related to improving response times. And I heard what you just said about improving response time citywide. I think it would be, I think it's important to, because we've talked a lot about the master plan, to see, to have budget impact data on implementing, beginning to implement, phasing in some sort of implementation of the fire station master plan. And since there's, and I didn't see anything on the budget impact sheets related to this, or the slide, because as we know, Northeast Ann Arbor, especially in the Northeast Ann Arbor area, response times been shown to be the poorest, and on the northeast side, the population is growing significantly. So if you could just comment on what you're contemplating for the budget.
I want to answer your question, but I also want to talk a little bit about the performance measures as we, if you give me 2 minutes of your toleration.
Sure.
You know, part of metrics is that they have to be reliable, they have to be reproducible, and you have to have a reliable source of data. So what Chief Kennedy has done with the IT group is they've mapped out response time around the city based upon a drive time. And within that modeling scenario of the current firehouses we have, we can cover well over 80% of the time, or 80% of the city with a 4-minute response time. Now that depends upon us getting the alert timely from HVA for our crews to meet the 60-second turnout time for medical emergencies and 80-second for fire emergencies. And then it's a travel time question, as Chief Kennedy had talked about. So there's a difference between modeling and actual performance, and we need to improve the sorts of data, as Chief had talked about, so we can continue to assess and evaluate. And that's throughout the city. As when we look at metrics, we want to identify where the data comes from, what's the math, and what's the benchmark. So, and we're going to continue to do that. The reason for putting forward the dashboards is to give those externally facing metrics to both you and to the public to judge whether we're doing a good job or not, and that serves as the basis of future adjustments. We also have internal metrics that judge efficiency, outputs, and things that speak towards the efficiency of the organization as well. Now, related to the fire master plan, one of our goals is to look at Station 2, which is currently essentially unoccupied. The inspectors are there, the county has some storage there, but it doesn't provide fire service. We are looking at rezoning that and then selling it. Both those items will come to council. The proceeds of that firehouse will use to fund improvements in House 1, which is right across the street, fire headquarters, and we can put the inspectors there. That'll give them better control under Chief Tyler, Assistant Chief Tyler. And I got to be honest, Assistant Chief Tyler, Chief Kennedy have done a wonderful job at improving the efficiency of fire inspection. A couple of years ago, they accounted for $1 million out of the general fund in addition to the fees that they're collecting. They're now cut that about by 50%. So they're more efficient. There's a lot of retraining and oversight that was missing before. Moving them closer to the headquarters also will help with that scrutiny. We'll also be able to look at putting some solar on the roof of House 1, as well as doing some modifications to House 6, which is down by the mall. So that's a plan for upgraded 2 of the houses with no additional funding out of the general fund. We've had some discussions with the developer of the county farm project, Mr. Grokoff, about part of the community benefit of that being replacement of House 4, which is on Platte Road. And by moving that firehouse into the development, it actually provides for better response time to the north and northeast, to the part of the city that's really east, mostly in Second Ward. And then we've had conversations with the university about replacing House 5, since that's theirs, and that's been favorably received, although we do need to have some firmer discussions about the scheduling of it. And I would think by moving it a little further north, it can improve response times as well. So we've had discussions with their facility staff as well as Cynthia Wilbanks about that, and we're going to continue to work with them. That leaves House 3 out by Vets Park is the only one where we don't have a funding approach right now. And that may be something that we do fund out of the sinking fund Mr. Crawford talked about, where we're putting money aside each year for future needs. So there's a plan there. Most of that is spelled out in the master plan that Chief Kennedy sent about a week and a half ago, I think, or I sent out on his behalf. But there is a plan to do that, and that's where we are.
Okay, thanks. Because tonight's presentation, the slides, the budget impact sheets are silent on the fire station master plan and improving response time. So having that data and having the budget respond to those needs and that data would be welcome. On police staffing, so as you know, I've advocated regularly year after year for incrementally having back the police officers that were cut previously in order to reinvigorate community policing, which was one of Hillard Hines' primary recommendations, along with the Oversight Commission that I hear said you've got $150,000 set aside for that. It's not clear to me what the proposal here is for police staffing. In your slide 20 in the budget impact sheet, again, you showed the 2 FTEs for the police cadet program, but you also show 130,000 K reduction in recurring expenses for, quote, personnel changes. So if you could clarify, Chief Honest, your recommendation on police staffing and the cost savings.
So the personnel changes that, when these numbers were calculated, those savings were due to actually vacancies? What was the second half of that question?
So the 130,000 reduction in recurring expenses for personnel changes, those are vacancies? I'm sorry.
That was my understanding, yes.
Okay. And so it seems to me, and I think I heard you say earlier that the staffing for police today were 7 below what was budgeted?
We'll be 7 below at the end of the month, yes.
At the end, I'm sorry, at the end of the fiscal year?
At the end of this month,
At
we
the
have
end
a
of this
retirement.
month? So it sounds like we've abandoned any thoughts of pursuing the recommendation on reinvigorating community-oriented police. Is that a fair statement?
I think ultimately that'd be a great goal, but as I said, with the confluence right now of very few people applying to be the police and our capacity to actually get officers through the program, it takes about 1.5 years from beginning to end. So right now we're working on increasing our capacity, where we have more background investigators, more field training officers. So, down the road, that would be an excellent discussion. I think right now this is, it's a challenge just to maintain what we are authorized, and I think this police cadet was a very creative way to fill in a lot of holes.
Yeah, but so on your slide 20 then, I mean, I saw, all that, equipment, replacement purchases, the various things that you list there. I just didn't see staffing. So I just want to confirm that. And then just one last question about FTEs.
Can I address that? You're referring to the 130? Okay, so just to clarify, the vacancies were for people who were retiring, and that 130 is a economic change because the new employees are going to be less expensive than the ones who are leaving.
Okay.
And that's why you're seeing that there. It's really an economic change. It is not a reduction in the FTEs.
It's not an increase either. Okay.
And just to emphasize what Chief said, we recognized when we went through this last year and the year before that we have a challenge with the current way the FTO program works. And Chief, in part consultation with the union, has changed the requirements for FTOs. Is that the right abbreviation?
Yes.
And
For
I think
I'm
that'll
sorry, for
field training officers?
Field training officers, so the people
Sworn
that actually
officers?
train the officers, we used to have, they had to be here for a certain period of time. We are now acknowledging some previous police experience, so if they already came here from another agency,
Oh, okay.
full-time police experience. And we had to do that because we have so many young officers now, we had to expand our FTO program, the
Okay.
field training officer program,
Okay.
which we are in the process
Didn't know
of.
that, okay.
So
Lingo?
last year, we did add 2 police officers to the budget. And the thought by adding the police cadets is they can take over some of the administrative tasks, like staffing at the desk and other things that'll occur. That'll free a couple officers to be back on active patrol, in addition to giving the police department a recruiting tool to go out and seek people who in the past may not have been interested in careers as police officers.
Okay, and then just a general FTE question. I'll probably be following up on,
Sure.
number of sworn officers, year to year kind of thing. It seems like there's a few new FTEs proposed for fiscal year '20, and if you could circle back to let us know how many there are in total, how many of those are in the general fund, and if you could provide us a detailed schedule of the recommended FTE changes, job titles.
So generally speaking, the changes in the general fund FTEs are due to the cadet.
I'm sorry.
They're due to the cadet programs.
I'm talking about FTEs in general.
I
for the-
realize
for-
that.
Yeah, general fund.
And we'll talk about those as we go through some of the different
Excuse me?
enterprise funds. But, a big part of the concern has been general fund staffing. And there's less than, Chief Kennedy talked about a reduction of 1 inspector. We're adding a quarter FTE, 1 1/4 FTEs. It tends to balance out so that the net increase is really due to the 3 cadet positions. But we'll give you the complete summary of adds and deletes and the balance of staffing.
Okay, I have other questions, but I'll let other people.
Councilmember Amlawi.
Thank you, Mayor. My questions mostly pertain to community services, I think. I don't actually have anything. The real easy ones first are like, you had talked about 3 FTEs in the building department to help improve services.
Yep.
What, real quickly, are those areas, if you could describe for us?
We have an additional building inspector. We have been maxed out almost constantly for the last year on inspections. We're more than 98% filled in slots. And that does not include an army of temp building inspectors, additional contractor building inspectors we've brought in from Carlisle to assist us in keeping up with demand. And we just have not seen any reduction in demand. So we are proposing an additional building inspector. Our goal is always to have an inspector on site within 48 hours of being requested so that they are available. We've managed to keep that goal over the last year for the most part. We've dragged a few times when we've had vacations and others, but we've been using a significant amount of temps and contract employees to keep that up and just can't see that volume. We don't see that volume going down anytime in the near future, so we think that's justified. One of the things we did recently that has been extraordinarily successful is we hired we refer to her as a program manager. She's basically an ombudsman for the certificate of occupancy issuance. She has become a primary point of contact, or the position has become a primary point of contact within the building department for anybody who's seeking a certificate of occupancy. Her job is to facilitate that process for people who are looking to gain occupancy within the community, and has had a significant impact on that. We're proposing to hire a second person to assist with that, again, because the volume is there and justified. And then the third point, or the third person we're proposing, is one that it's a position we've been discussing with Bragg on a regular basis, and that is a supervisor of inspectors, someone who manages both our building, trade, and rental inspectors, and is a primary point of contact in-house to help with scheduling concerns. If someone needs a last-minute scheduling to keep a project moving, is making sure our inspectors are scheduled in a geographic area that is most appropriate to lessen travel times across the city, to be there to answer questions about inspections and when they're necessary and when they're not. in City Hall on a regular basis. So those three positions and conversations with the building community and the residential community are the ones we think that can be the most assistance to them, keeping projects moving and keeping on our goals of being at inspections within a reasonable amount of time. All of those are paid out of the construction fund. None of those have no general fund impacts whatsoever.
The omnibudsman, do they, from the time of application to the certificate of occupancy, it's assigned to one person from start to finish?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking. Currently, the position we have basically deals with from the time of the request of a certificate of occupancy, and then that through the completion of that issuance. The second person, what we hope to do is have people be able to reassign both of them from the time a permit is requested all the way through occupancy. So it would expand that to the front end of the process as well, not just the back end. And we would split those projects up between the two.
Okay, thank you. And then the park planner, does that come within our, are we hiring someone from outside the department, or would that be someone from within? Just
Offhand, I don't know if anybody's qualified within. If there are, certainly they would be considered. The posting would most likely start with internal candidates, and then if we don't have qualified internal candidates, would expand to outside for consideration.
We talked about the master plan. I appreciate having that in the budget. It came in at $500,000 to begin with. My concern is this a beginning of as much as I'm interested in seeing us revisit that and making changes, is it going to be 500 of what will end up being $4 million at one point, or what are our costs be in doing that?
And my hope is, and like I said earlier, we have a placeholder in there right now, based on what some other communities have spent of like size, based on what our staffing is, based on what we think the expertise we know is. We have the RFP out now. We'll have the responses and hopefully narrowed it down to the preferred candidate, or at least the top three, and have a much tighter range of numbers for you by the time you have to adopt the budget. So if it's going to be significantly more than 500, and that's what we're recommending, you'll know before we're asking you to make a decision. Hopefully, we're relatively close.
So it'll be like a closed system of sorts. It's not going to be a slow drip where we're going to be requesting
When the
more.
contract is actually put in front of you for consideration, it'll be just like any other contract with a recommended not to exceed amount.
Appreciate that.
No worries.
Then there was talking about allocating somebody for the tree line. There was $256,000, something to that effect. What portion of that 256 is going to be assigned to someone to look at the tree line?
That is part of funding of an existing FTE. I think that I'd have to look at, see the $30,000 or $40,000 that's on the impacts sheet. So that's to pay for, a quarter to a third of an individual's time.
Okay. And then lastly, there was a request for a placeholder for $100,000 additional for succession. I think this year, the previous year, there was $500,000 allocated, and did that not cover, or are we expecting to have to replace more people who are retiring?
I forget Tom, what year was it when that was established? Do you remember?
2-3 years ago.
Yeah, it predates me, so it's at least 3 years old. And when I first saw that, I thought that was a pretty creative plan supported by council authorizing up to 10 FTEs. The FTEs are not a problem. Typically, when we use them to replace police or fire, the incoming person is lower salary than the outgoing, so it doesn't have a negative impact. But as you know, the city attorney had significant turnover in his office, and to quote Barry Switzer of days gone by, he didn't rebuild, he reloaded. So Mr. Postma set a great example for how to manage staff retirements, but attorneys can be a little on the higher end of the scale, and we learned a lot from that process. In order to continue having that continuity, we just need to add another $100,000 because the pot is basically empty right now. And it's a one-time fund. It's not recurring year to year.
Okay. Well, appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm just going to pop in. I guess I'd like to say, overall, I would like to thank staff for what is plainly a first release of what ultimately will be a budget that, reflects a lot of, service efficiencies. A lot of cost savings winds its way through the document, through the presentation that we see here, and the budget that we'll ultimately receive, and that's excellent, and thank you for that. This is a communications quibble, and this is with respect to our dashboards on our financials, on our financial condition, and that is, and furthermore, with respect to the discussion of the projected operating deficit and the projected deficit. I understand that we have an ongoing structural problem with revenues that are anticipated to increase at a rate different than expenditures. But when people think deficit, they think, I believe, in the government context, they think credit card borrowing federal government. And when we talk about a projected deficit in 2025 of what looks like $10 million, that, if I were reading it and I didn't know, have a lot of history behind this, I would think we're planning to borrow $10 million in 2025 to cover our deficit in order to pay for ongoing services, and that's not true. What we will do in 2021 and 22 and 23 and 24 is we will find efficiencies or cut services because we need to have a balanced budget at the end. I very much appreciate that we're trying to communicate to residents that we do have a structural problem, a structural asymmetry between the rate of increase for expenditures and the rate of expenditures with respect to existing services and the rate of increase with respect to anticipated revenues. But, I'm more of a problem guy than a solution guy on this one at this point. I'd ask for staff to think that through and whether that can be explicated so that someone without a background in how we do things and what we will not do will have a fuller understanding of the situation. Councilmember Hayner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd just add to what you said about that, that we're also, I think we've tossed it around that we're looking at, different, unique approaches to revenue growth also. And so I'm looking forward to having all those conversations moving
Absolutely.
forward. I had a couple questions for different folks, but perhaps Mr. Lazarus can answer them. Just some things I didn't understand what they were. Under the development, in the snapshot here, it says OCD reduced county contract. I didn't know what that meant. What was that referring to? Reduced county contract starting in fiscal year 21.
We contract with the county to provide services that we don't. And we're going to systematically look at all the contracts we have with the county, and then we'll adjust in 21. So it's really a placeholder at this point. Most of what OCED is, the Office of Community and Economic Development, so we'll look at the services that are there, we look at the agreement, and same with the Health and Human Services that, they manage the HHSAB, and we'll look at those. So at this point, it's a placeholder in 21, because we want to look at the agreements. We want to be supportive of the services we get. We also want it to be a balanced relationship.
Okay, and it was under the police snapshot here, but it said loss of revenue from solid waste. I just wondered what that meant.
Solid waste used to reimburse the police for a community standards officer.
Okay.
We are going, as part of the solid waste resource management plan, we're going to assign a full-time inspector in the downtown to address alleyways and other collection issues. So because that's going to be funded out of the solid waste fund, to continue to put the $30,000 in the police department is a little bit of a double hit to the solid waste management fund.
And
I'm sorry?
cleaning that up, you mean? Yeah. We've gotten a lot of...
I think we all recognize that the alleyways have been problematic.
Yeah.
So the intent is to assign a full-time community standards officer to assist and to be, Mr. Delacourt talked about ombuds people, provide that liaison and ombuds to the businesses in the downtown. So it's a it'd be a double hit to the fund if we didn't take it out.
I mean, I have all sorts of questions. I mean, we could go on and on, but I don't know how
Are
much
there
we're
any
supposed
council
to
members
ask
who
or
have
what.
not yet questioned?
Yeah,
Councilmember
I'll
Nelson.
do that and I'll come back. I have some general ones, so, thank you.
I can't wait to hear all of Jeff's questions. My question's from slide 7. I'm curious, the last couple bullet points, the additional funding of $24,000 for mayor and council, that doesn't relate to the first bullet point about converting the .75 FTE to 1.0 FTE, or those are two separate things?
They are.
Oh, okay. Well, can you explain them? Because it wasn't clear to me when you explained the first time, I'm sorry. The last bullet, particularly the last bullet point about the $24,000, because it's going to the mayor and council, so what's my piece of that? I'm just kidding.
So a large part of that is the requirement to create a council workplace up on the, really across the, so there's a better, if you will, color printer scanner than the temporary piece of equipment that we've provided. It provides for a key code entry into that area, requires some warmer furniture to quote Ms. Bannister, so people feel comfortable in their house, and to provide a comfortable space for small collaboration with members of the community. Obviously, the council workroom is still available, after hours and on weekends and when it's not scheduled, but this is something to provide the kind of space that certain council members have asked for. There's some other costs in there as well. I talked about, a $500 per council member allowance. That comes out to $5,500 out of that total as well. And then there's some other miscellaneous costs.
Thank you. And actually, going to the point that you just made, I will say that there have been a number of times that I've been in this building and realized that I had 45 minutes to kill, and I've just sat in one of the uncomfortable chairs on that side of the room trying to find a plug to plug in my computer. So that will be helpful to me if we have a space to work in.
Yeah, and part of this will be a work in progress. To close that space in entirely, we'd have to redo the HVAC system, and the money gets pretty big in terms of the $60,000 to $70,000 range. So, by putting in a noise attenuating screen, providing some comfortable furniture, making sure that there's adequate lighting when you need the room, because your badge gives you access to City Hall on a 24/7 basis to give you a comfortable area to do the things that you need to do. I think it's a relatively small cost that has a big benefit for our elected officials.
Councilmember Smith.
And after?
Just a real quick question. It would be a shame not to ask Mr. Stiglitz a question about dams, since he is here specifically for that. We've been planning for a long time for some of this work. You mentioned that FERC is, after continually changing what they're asking us to do, and we've got a big ticket item in fiscal 2022 planned. I know you can't read the future, but we've been talking dams for the entire time I've been on council. Can we continue to expect somewhat regular expenditures in this ballpark to take care of our dams?
Yes. We obviously do, just like the rest of the city, we do some condition assessment and planning. So we've been doing that, and our current capital project plan over the next 6 years identifies what we anticipate the needs are. I think we're doing a reasonable job of staying on top of it, but again, we're dealing with, in some cases, 100-year-old dams, and there are definitely things that we have to address from a safety standpoint. So I don't anticipate things going away completely.
Okay, thank you.
If I can add to that, I talked briefly about sort of a sinking fund for facilities improvements, and Mr. Crawford talked a little bit about taking statutory revenues and setting them aside. We hope to have the discipline to start putting monies aside so we don't have not necessarily catastrophic failure of a dam, but catastrophic impacts on the general fund, because that's a general fund obligation. And by putting the money aside, we hope that we don't have to either reduce services, deplete fund balance, or bond for the money. there may be some of that required in the future, but I think it's prudent for us to start stocking money away for the rainy day.
Questions from council members who have not asked questions? Councilmember Lum.
Thanks. Just on the dams, I'll just say, back in the 90s, the dams have historically not generated enough hydroelectric power to offset the maintenance costs. And back in the 90s, the city did a study and approached DTE to see if there was any interest in maybe purchasing the dams, and that went nowhere. But it's been an ongoing issue that we've been studying. So thanks again. I will just say, to follow on to some of your comments, Mayor Taylor, about the materials, I would like to thank Mr. Crawford and everyone for the thorough materials, and also just say on page 11, the slide 11, so you're coming about the general fund deficit. You look at fiscal year 21, you see, yeah, that the general fund deficit is a small recurring deficit of 110,000, which, when you add again, 167,000 of net one-time costs, the total general fund deficit for fiscal year 21 is $277,000. So it's still relatively small numbers for second year out. So, which also moves me to compliment Mr. Crawford for his leadership in making sure we adhere to solid budget disciplines, like not adding recurring costs when we don't have recurring, when there's not a recurring revenue source, and also funding our legacy obligations beyond the minimal amounts that are required, or not much at all, as some cities do. And our strong credit rating, our AA+ credit rating from Standard & Poor's, has certainly a lot to do with those disciplines. So hats off to Mr. Crawford for that leadership, for his leadership on that. Just question, if I may, about the county's millage proceeds. Pardon me. Your slide 8 indicated that, quote, per council policy, the millage proceeds will be allocated 40-40-20 to climate action, affordable housing, and pedestrian safety. And I recognize that the majority, that's what the majority of council voted for in the resolution of intent in September of 2017. But as you know, we're currently in the process of surveying citizens on their preferences for how that $2 million plus in unassigned revenues should be spent, and we'll have the results relatively soon. So my question here relates to process. And Mr. Lazarus, is your plan to allocate funds 40-40-20 in your proposed budget April 15th, regardless of what the feedback may be?
We're following as I said, the council policy. We'll get the feedback from the survey about, sometime towards the end of March, and then that'll come back to council, and then council chooses to change the allocation strategy. We'll have to show great dexterity in adopting the budget, hopefully before it's submitted on April 15th. To go into each one of those, the affordable housing has been highlighted both in the citizen survey that we do through the through the NCS process, and through the last open survey that we did. And I think that's generally a value. All these things are values that the city has, but unfortunately, sometimes when funding's on the table, we pit core values against each other. For the climate change, renewable energy, and resiliency program, those things that are of a recurring nature, we've tried to protect as a recurring expenditure, and those things that we may have to find other sources of funds for, we've treated as non-recurring, and we'll have to find a way to accommodate as much of that important work as we can as well. But again, it was a 40-40-20 allocation. Council gave us the policy direction to do that, and we'll continue to do that until the policy changes.
Okay, so it sounds like you're trying to read between the lines what you just said, or try to
I'm trying to be
sort
flexible,
out what you just said, that your
that
proposed April 15th budget, regardless of, and I'm talking about the feedback to the survey on the citizens' preferences for this $2 million, not the other surveys that you just mentioned, but on how that money should be spent. I'm asking because if so, if your proposed budget is going to be this allocation recommendation, it may be appropriate for council to consider another resolution of intent prior to April 15th. That's why I'm asking what your plan is.
So, not, with no disrespect and not being redundant, we're going to follow the policy guidance that we've gotten from council.
So the answer is
until it's
that-
changed.
So your
Yes.
answer is yes, that is going to be in your proposed budget, this 40-40-20 allocation of that $2 million plus dollars,
Yes.
regardless of what the feedback may be. Okay, so I have the answer for another resolution of intent then. Okay, thank you. Streetlight question. There's $105,000 mentioned for new streetlights, not streetlight replacements. Would that be recurring funding? And how much, if any, recurring or one-time funding for new streetlights is there elsewhere in the budget?
You have that in front of you. Is it 100, was it
105 mentioned for new streetlights.
For new, okay.
Not replacements.
So, in the general fund this year, you may recall that we have an asset funding plan for streetlights repair and replacement. And these are not new streetlights. The portion that you see in the millage, if that were in the general fund, we would be 100% funded for that plan. We would do that each year. We did not have it in the general fund, so we left it in that millage.
So there's not one time or
We have about 400,000 or so.
elsewhere in the budget?
Already budgeted in general fund, and we need that, the portion that's in a millage, were it to move to the general fund, would give us our 100% annual funding that we'd like for streetlights.
For existing streets.
You're talking about the
Existing
county
streetlights.
millage proceeds again?
Yep.
Remember also, though, that some of the excess funds that were in the risk fund, we took $1.5 million and allocated towards pedestrian improvements. The focus is on crosswalk improvements, which is signals, markings, and lighting.
Okay, thanks.
I've got Councilmember Haynard, Councilmember Ronlawi, if you could, if that's Councilmember Bannister hasn't yet spoken, let's have her, we may jump the queue. I'd like to get to public comment at 8:45 and get us to our warm and cozy homes. Councilmember Bannister.
Okay, thanks. I just sort of wanted to piggyback on what Jane was saying, is that it might be wise to have like a Plan B ready so that there isn't great dexterity needed at the last minute there on that 40-40-20, just based on how I read my colleagues on that previous discussion.
I appreciate the advice and warning, so thank you.
Yes. And then, is that one FTE that was on slide 7 and slide 30, is that, I'm not aware that council had administrative
There's
help.
a management assistant in mayor's office, and our intent is to increase, but Christine also handles requests from council on occasion. The goal is to increase the FTE to a full FTE so we can provide for more general rounded support.
Okay, yeah, I guess I hadn't utilized a working relation, with her this past year, so.
Again, it's a way, there's been, with changing council, there are different expectations and demands, and we want to be able to meet them.
Okay, we'll hear more, if you can provide more on ways I might interact with her, that'd be great. And then my last question was just on that one FTE for the park planner and the tree line trail, what does are those two one and the same, or what is the park planner gonna do, and what's the tree line trail gonna do this year with that?
I'll let Mr. Delacour talk about the park planner, but the money for the tree line trail support is an existing staff member separate from the parks planner.
And I can add, the park planner is not, currently the work being done on the tree line is not part of the parks budget. So this would be a person paid for out of the parks millage to help us implement the litany of projects that we have programmed within the parks department, park improvements, trail improvements. We just have gotten to the point now where we have so many projects and so much capital aligned that one person is just not able to execute all those projects. There's a demand to see them done, and we think we could be much more efficient with two folks. Again, it's something that's paid for out of the parks millage, not something that comes out of the general fund.
So it's all the parks, all of them, just
Correct.
as need
We
be?
have one. At one point, I believe the city had up to 3 or 3.5 FTEs. We were cut back to 1. That was functional when we were operating with about a $750,000 capital budget per year. We're now exceeding about $1.5 million in available capital from the parks millage, just due to increased tax revenues and on properties. One person just isn't able to execute all those projects. We're falling behind. And we feel there's a demand to see those projects done, and that the allocation of a staff person will help us get those projects in the ground quicker.
Okay. And just, could you clarify, or one of the two of you, that tree line trail, just so I understand I'm meeting with tree line trail people tomorrow, and what is it in the budget that we're gonna do for them already?
So the project manager we have is Heather Sayfarth out of Systems Planning. Her time has been allocated through the CIP, and there's no additional funding. So in order to pay for that portion of her time dedicated to the tree line, we had to find a funding source. So that's what the $40,000 is for.
Thank you.
Councilor Hayner, then Marlawi, if you could each keep it
I'll
under
be
5.
brief. In fact, I think I probably should email this, but since you called me, I appreciate it, Mr. Mayor.
Sure.
So this is a question for Mr. Crawford, I believe, and it actually came up at our audit meeting. It didn't come up at the audit committee meeting. Public Act 57 had superseded Public Act 75 in 1978 for the DDAs, and that took effect on January 1st. And I was just wondering if you could let us know if that has any effect on our bonding payments, TIF capture, TIF collection, our relationship with the DDA. PA 57 has superseded the original act of 1978 or 75, it was.
Sure, I'll get back to you on
Well,
that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Councilor Marlawi.
Thank you, Mayor Taylor. I've been up here for a few months now, and I think I haven't felt this disappointed until about 5 or 10 minutes ago when Councilmember Lum asked about the county millage. I kind of gave it a pass when I looked at this the first time because it did say per existing council policy. It seems like the wishes of this current council are not being respected with discussions. There is, in my opinion, a lack of good faith here in how we're operating. And furthermore, this allotment of 40-40-20 not only does not act in good faith, but doesn't even reflect what our citizens demand of us. If anything, 40% should be going to pedestrian safety right now, not 20%. And I will be strongly supporting Councilmember Lum and others and passing a resolution to look at this issue and not make any decisions before our budget is passed in May. This right now is very disappointing. The way this is structured, there's no plan B. And frankly, 20% for pedestrian safety is woefully inadequate.
Well, as I said, we respond and take guidance from the actions that council passes as a whole. That's the current guidance. And these are all community values that are important. They are identified both in the National Citizen Survey and the other recently completed survey as well. Certainly, council can change its policy guidance through action of council as a whole. With regard to pedestrian safety, mentioned a couple times, we're taking an extra $1.5 million from the excess in the risk fund and applying it towards pedestrian safety as well. All of our capital improvement projects also address pedestrian safety as well as bicycle safety when they're done on our roadways where appropriate. So I think, to be honest, it's good when council focuses on outcomes and objectives and lets us program dollars to where they should be applied. The county millage rebate is a special source of funds. Mr. Crawford set up special tracking for it. And as I said, we are guided by the actions council takes as a whole.
Again, I would hope that we'd operate in better good faith.
Councilmember Grant.
I know I heard some requests for Plan B, but I think it would be impossible to make a Plan B without knowing the results of said survey to make that plan. I mean, that's the whole point of doing the survey, right? So I understand the frustration of feeling not being listened to perhaps in the plan, but if the point was to do the survey and adjust from there, you can't predict what the survey, otherwise the survey would just be bogus, right? So, I don't know how one would make a Plan B without knowing the results of the survey.
The core of any
Other than
city program is the exceptional staff that we have. And through the Office of Sustainability and Innovation, we have funded through recurring revenues in the general fund and through municipal reimbursement charges and other allocations of funding. We have made sure that we protect the staffing that's in place. What's in the millage are the programs that will make us exceptional, that will return us to being leaders in the field, and that will address the climate action goals of the community. If that funding is reduced or diverted, we'll have to both, we will always respect and honor the direction from council, but we'll always try and find sources of funding to achieve the values of the community as well.
Councilor Lowe.
Thank you, Councilmember Remlawi. I really appreciate your cutting to the chase, because hearing lots of jargon here and not asking for a Plan B, the Plan A should be, when I asked you the question, if you're going to allocate the funds 40-40-20 in your proposed April 15th budget, regardless of what the survey feedback would be, and your answer is yes. And I'm not talking about, and we're not talking about the National Citizen Survey and these other surveys, because this council allocated and approved funds to do a statistically valid survey on the $2+ million from the county millage proceeds. We're going to get that feedback at the end of March. So there's adequate time to reflect the citizen feedback in the budget recommendations for that unassigned money. And I hear you talking about, the whole idea was to do, again, a statistically valid citizen survey on their preferences for how that $2 million plus a year should be spent. And we're going to have the results relatively soon enough, and they're apparently going to be ignored. That is the frustration. That's the disappointment. And I don't think that message is confusing. It certainly shouldn't be, and yet apparently there is confusion about what that intent was.
If I can square the circle a little bit on this, a couple of things. I guess I'd say, as I heard, I'd like to defend staff's position on this. The staff is charged with listening to council as a whole, as council acts through its resolutions. The resolution that currently exists is 40-40-20, and that's staff's obligation to comply with that until that changes. With respect to the survey, in the first instance, the survey was described as a data point, described as a tool for council members who felt that a tool for council members who felt that that information was useful in making their decisions with respect to the use of the county millage. It's a tool for us to evaluate how for those members who are interested in the survey, to consider and to incorporate into their thoughts about how the county millage money should be spent. It's not for staff, I don't believe, to override it's not staff's position to override a council resolution based upon a citizen survey. That's council's decision to instruct staff on how to divide it up. and how to use it. In my view, that answer was proper. It didn't, and I think fully fleshed out, I think the answer would be staff will not deviate from 40-40-20 until council tells it to. And when council tells it to, it will deviate from 40-40-20 if that's council's resolution. I will do everything I can for my part, since we're talking about this, to honor the 40-40-20 promise. 40-40 promise, in my view, was a promise that the city council as an institution made to the voters prior to voting and was germane to people, was relevant to people who went to the ballot box on this issue. And so I'm going to do everything I can to honor that, because I believe that it is, I believe that it's, I've said it. I had Councilmember Griswold, Councilmember Lum, and we're up against 8:45, so perhaps we can run the queue this way.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank staff for the additional focus on pedestrian safety.
Councilmember Lum.
I just find it in general incongruous for our staff to, Mr. Lazarus is standing there and citing the National Citizen Survey and other survey instruments that we've used to guide budgeting, funding, recommendations, and yet simultaneous to that, and here's the incongruity, we will ignore a survey that's being conducted specifically to determine how this, and again, this is unprecedented to have such a large, significant sum of money unassigned, unallocated, and while some believe, as you do obviously, Mr. Mayor, and I respect that, but we disagree, that this is a promise we made to citizens, we know that about 3/4 of the people who voted were not aware of this council resolution that was approved in early September. So we've talked about that at length at other council meetings, but again, we can't hang our hat on some survey instruments and ignore others.
I don't think we are. Again, the first thing to consider is that we've treated the county millage rebate as non-recurring funds, so that while they will impact the reallocation of those funds, if it were to occur, will impact the programs we've outlined tonight. We've taken great care to make sure we protect those things that are core values of this community. The survey that, and we've had, to be open, Councilmember, we've had discussions and sometimes disagreements over what's policy and what's operations. My statement is due respect to the council's policymaking role, and that is expressed by resolutions passed by council as a whole. And with that, I do want to thank all of staff. Mr. Crawford was due to, appropriately called out, but there was also support from his team as well as staff throughout the city. As I said at the beginning, we've all worked together to find areas where we can have greater efficiencies, where we can find better ways to do things and then free up monies for other things that are expressed values of the community. I think we're all very proud and pleased with what's in the budget, and we really do look forward to this kind of open and honest exchange with council as we look to the future. So again, thank you for your time this evening, and we'll always be responsive to your questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you all who had the opportunity to come up and answer questions, and those who didn't. Thank you each and one. We now come to public comment general time. Public comment general time is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to council and the community about matters of municipal interest. To speak at public comment general time, one need not have signed up in advance. Speakers have 3 minutes in which to speak, so please pay close attention to the time clock. As a matter of courtesy, we may have only one person speaking at a time. And finally, if you require assistance in speaking before council, we'd be delighted to provide it to you. Is there anyone who would like to speak at public comment?
John Dingle served a lifetime for the public, and so I felt it was only appropriate to thank him for his lifetime of service, but to do it in a manner that is a true form of public engagement. We had a 3-minute speech during public comment at City Hall. He served a lifetime, I'll serve my 3 minutes. Before I even entered the United States some 20 years ago, I knew of the name John Dingle. Back then, he wasn't serving Ann Arbor yet, but I'd heard his name frequently as we watched the Detroit news channels. You see, us Canadians found American politics to be much more interesting than Canadian politics, and I think that is true to this day. For myself, as a Canadian who was far from being political at the time, I pretty much knew of only a few American politicians. I knew of a president, I may have known who the governor was, and I had certainly heard of this John Dingell in Lower Michigan. Needless to say, I recall moving to Ann Arbor, and eventually I found out that he was here as well. No insult to the mayor or council members, but I usually do not get starstruck with politicians. But with John, I was. And I knew that the area where I was living was in good hands. I grew up in Sioux, Ontario, and there's something quite remarkable that happens on the border. You know that American flags are lowered to half-staff, but you may not know that out of respect, another flag is also lowered to half-staff. In the Sioux, we have the International Bridge. I should note that I'm speaking for myself and not the bridge or MDOT. And on that bridge sits an American flag and a Canadian flag. You can see the flags on the bridge webcam, and you know what? It's not just the American flag that has been lowered, but the Canadian flag has been lowered as well on that bridge. The Canadian me heard of John Dingell long ago is thankful that the Canadian flag has been lowered out of respect for our loss. And that's what a good neighbor does. A good neighbor mourns and shows respect when their neighbor mourns. And to be a bit political, a good neighbor builds a bridge where they honor their neighbor instead of a bridge that damns their neighbor. John was a friend to Ann Arbor. He was a friend to the public. And I know that he was a friend to many of you on council. I'm sorry for the loss of our friend. To a lifetime of service from the Canadian me and from the American in me, thank you for your service, John Dingell. And to Debbie, current and former council members that covered John, and even to the journalists that covered John all these years, my deepest condolences to our loss. Thank you, John Dingell. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Glenn Nelson, co-chair of Citizens for Mental Health and Public Stability, Public Safety. I want to reinforce the discussion that was stimulated by Council Member Lum on the survey. The survey was every much a legitimate action of the entire board, as was the resolution. It deserves respect from the administration, which should react to the entire board. I think the survey has been ignored by administration. The administration, which respected the survey, would structure the budget work plan so it could incorporate that information. There is a work session on March 11th, ideally timed for a discussion of and reflection on the results of the survey. I think you will know whether your administration is putting a thumb on the scale or not by whether it puts the survey results and the budget implications on the agenda on March 11th. That's a perfect time for talking about it, and the council indicated they wanted to talk about it.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at public comment? Seeing no one, public comment is closed. May I have a motion to adjourn? Moved by Councilmember Smith, seconded by Councilmember Nelson. Discussion. Favor? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? We're adjourned.